Afro Tales podcast is a part of the Connected Podcast Network. Welcome, my friends, to Afro Tales Presents Unearthly Accounts. I am your host, the Shadow Man, and I will share with you stories with a more supernatural feel. So, without further ado, let's begin. The Chenoo. Long ago, during the moon of falling leaves, a woman and her two brothers traveled to the north to set up a hunting camp, hoping to bring back enough furs and meat for the winter. They went far away from their village, much farther than anyone had gone in a long time. During the first 2 days after making camp, the hunting was very good. Each day, the two brothers would go hunting. The sister, whose name was Nolka, would stay behind to tend their camp and prepare any game caught the day before. On the third day, however, while out hunting, the brothers came across a very large set of footprints. Those footprints were over 2 feet long and 10 feet apart. Kneeling down, Howls, the older of the two brothers, carefully inspected each track. Great-grandfather told me of a creature who makes tracks like this. It's called a Chenoo. Howls lifted his head to scan the forest around them. Yes, I remember, answered Casco, Howls' younger brother. He said they were giant cannibals with sharp teeth and hearts made of ice, consuming the spirits of human beings, making them stronger. Looking closer at the tracks, the two men realized the huge footprints were headed in the direction of their camp. We must return and check on our sister, said Howls. Both men began to run back toward camp. Meanwhile, back at camp, unaware of any danger, Nolka was busy cleaning an elk hide. Several yards away, in a large fire pit, a pile of rocks were being heated up for her brother's evening sweat lodge. Having finished the hide, Nolka slowly stood up and added more wood to the fire. As she did so, she heard a sudden sound of breaking branches. She turned and looked up. There stood a huge Chenoo. Its large gray body was covered with pine, pitch, and leaves, and it wore a necklace of human skulls. Its legs and arms were as thick as tree stumps. Its open mouth revealed a sharp set of teeth, and its eyes were darker than a starless night. The Chenoo raised its arms, preparing to grasp Nolka in its long, bony fingers. Knowing there was nowhere to hide, Nolka thought quickly. Grandfather? She said with a smile. Where have you been? Grandfather, the Chenoo growled. It stopped in its tracks and looked confused. No human being had ever dared to speak to it this way before. Yes, Grandfather, I have been waiting all day here for you. Don't you even remember me? Nolka said. There was a long pause. Nolka did her best to appear calm. Granddaughter, roared the Chenoo. I have a granddaughter. Yes, of course you do. I have been preparing the sweat lodge for you all day, Nolka said, motioning toward the large pile of rocks glowing in the fire. She hoped to delay the Chenoo from trying to eat her until her brothers returned from hunting. So far, the plan was working. "Grandfather, please come into the lodge," she said, lifting up the door flap. "Thank you, granddaughter." The Chenoo rumbled as it walked over to the sweat lodge and bent down. Crawling in on its hands and knees, the giant squeezed through the door. Sitting down, his legs around the fire pit, the Chenoo filled the entire lodge. Walking over to the fire, Nolka picked up a large forked stick and carried one hot rock after another and began placing them in the center of the lodge. She was just pulling another rock out of the fire when she heard someone calling. Sister, what are you doing?" called Owosos, as he and Casco, both completely out of breath, came running into the clearing. "We saw huge tracks headed toward our camp," Casco said. "We were afraid that you—" Nolka held up a hand to her mouth, and her brother stopped talking. She looked over toward the lodge. "Our grandfather has finally arrived. Come and greet him." Then she picked up another glowing rock as she walked over to the lodge. Her brothers, totally confused, followed her. "Grandfather, your grandsons have returned to greet you," said Nolka to the Chenoo through the door of the lodge. "Grandsons? I have grandsons," roared the Chenoo. Looking into the lodge, Owosos and Casco could not believe it. There sat the very same monster whose tracks they had seen headed toward camp. "Hello, grandsons," the Chenoo rumbled. "Oh, yes. Hello, grandfather. It's good to see you," Casco said, after being nudged in the ribs by Nolka. "This lodge feels good. Bring me more rocks." "Yes, grandfather," Casco said. The two men and their sister piled one glowing rock after another in the center of the lodge. Then, after placing a large birch bark bucket full of water just inside the door of the lodge, they closed the flap. Moments later, a loud hissing sound came from inside the lodge as the Chenoo began to pour on the rocks. "Now's our chance to make a run for it," Nolka whispered to her brothers. The three of them began to quietly sneak out of camp, but they had not moved quickly enough. "More rocks! Bring me more rocks! Open the door!" roared the Chenoo. Nolka ran over and swung open the flap of the lodge. Owosos and Casco proceeded to bring in 4 more loads of rocks. Then, after the 4th load, the flap of the lodge was again closed. As soon as the lodge was closed, the sound of hissing steam came again from within the lodge. And just as before, just when they began to sneak away, the Chenoo shouted for them again. "Open the door! More rocks! More water!" "Yes, grandfather, we are coming." Quickly, Owosos and Casco brought more rocks as Nolka ran to the nearby stream to refill the birch bark bucket. When they opened the door to the lodge, huge gusts of steam flowed out so thickly that the only thing in the lodge they could see was the Chenoo's huge arm as it reached out to grab the freshly filled bucket of water. Closing the flap again, all 3 siblings agreed it was no use trying to run. The Chenoo would only call for them again, and sure enough, it did. "Open the door! More rocks, more water!" This time, they brought in every rock from the fire, even the rocks from the fire circle. They hoped the heat would be so great that Chenoo would pass out. Standing by the lodge, they listened closely. But, to their surprise, as the hissing sound of water hitting the rocks got louder and louder, the Chenoo began to sing. Waya, 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 oh. Waya, 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 oh. Then it paused to pour more water on the rocks before it sang again. Waya, 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 oh. Waya, 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 oh. This time the Chenoo sang, they noticed the voice didn't seem as loud. Again, they heard the sounds of steam rising as water was poured on the stones. Waya, 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 oh. Waya, 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 oh. The voice was much softer now. So soft it sounded like the voice of an old man. Waya, 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 oh. Waya, 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 oh. Then it was silent. Grandchildren, open the door. A little voice called from inside the sweat lodge. Wassos lifted up the door flap. A huge gust of steam flew out of the lodge, knocking him backward. As the steam rose into the air, a little old man crawled out of the lodge. As he stood up, the little old man began to cough. He coughed and coughed until he coughed up a huge piece of ice in the shape of a human heart. Falling to the ground, the heart-shaped piece of ice that was the bad spirit of the Chenoo shattered on a rock. Thank you, my grandchildren. You have saved me. I am no longer a monster. Now, I am truly your grandfather, said the old man with a smile. So Nolka and her two brothers took the old man who had been at Chenoo as their grandfather. They brought him back to their village, where he quietly and peacefully lived out the rest of his days. The end. The Chenoo, a cannibal giant whose heart is made of ice, is called by many different names among the northern people where winter is the most dangerous time of year. This creature, who is sometimes described as a human being transformed into a monster, howls like the storm wind and pursues his prey. But if its heart can be melted, it may be turned back into a person. A very similar being is called a Wendigo by the Cree. Thank you, my friends, for joining me this evening. And until next time, remember, you can always find me in the shadows.